Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and along with me today is James Kunz of Modern Day Debate. He was with us last week. You're not watching the same video. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some things that James has learned or noticed, some notes perhaps that he's taken about how Christians and atheists function in debates after, well, first of all, James, welcome to the show. And how many debates are we at right now, roughly?
My pleasure to be here. I think that right now it says maybe like 800s, 890. We've deleted a number of them though. So I'd say we're for sure in the 900s in terms of what we have done.
900 different debates?
Which is crazy, yeah.
That is really hard to imagine. How many a week are you up to now?
I would say sometimes, depending on the week, it could be as many as like 4. More commonly, probably 2 or 3.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to get new things out of you each time so that the audience, who only ever really sees you host and moderate, can know who you are. So one last question about you as a person. What is your favorite style of music, or if you have a favorite band or something?
Yeah, what I listen to most would probably be rock. I like to listen to rock like early 2000s, late 90s. That's like when I really got into rock, and
well, that's me.
I listen to that when I work out. So that's like the glory days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, dogs or cats? That's a good question for a debate guy.
It's really hard to pick.
No, you have to choose. You're not allowed to sit on the fence, James.
Boy, I mean, then I have to go with dogs. They're so loyal and they're so appreciative. They just love their owner, and very clearly they're much more
as opposed to cats, obviously. So, all right, but well, that's a good question. Have you ever done a debate on dogs or cats? It's a subjective debate, but have you ever done one?
That'd be an interesting one. We haven't done it yet.
Okay. All right. You have learned some things. I was blown away, and maybe this is one of them that you're thinking of. But last week you mentioned something that you picked up on about how Christians and atheists are different in what they prefer about a debate. You said that Christians tend to prefer formal debates, and atheists tend to prefer back and forth. And this may make sense of why you pretty much do opening statements and then back and forth usually. Isn't that what you do basically?
Right. Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. I think why that is, I'm not sure. I think that Christians do on like the big 5 personality traits, which are kind of like the most conventional, popular way of measuring personality among psychologists. Christians are a little bit more agreeable. And I kind of wonder if, so one thing I would just say is, I would highly encourage Christians to stick with a structured format where you have strictly equal time. Usually the Christian is kind of deferential and kind of like, oh, I want to care for the other person, and so I'm willing to defer to them on the format. But for some reason, I would say, no, Christians, if you want to compete in debate, more formal structures seem to work better. I'm trying to figure that out myself. It's tough to know exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm. But just me thinking off the top of my head, I've done it, both ways. And what I think, if I'm thinking about, obviously the benefit of the back and forth is you can really get into the meat of something, get into the details. And when someone is saying something that you specifically have a question about, you can say, well, right there, that's the thing that I'm concerned about. So there is something about that. I like formal debates, just anecdotal information about one apologist. I like the formal debates because the Christian is often, though this is not always the case, the Christian is often the one trying to set up some sort of structure and give some reason to believe a thing, which that involves that you need some space for that, and you need maybe some formal setup so that you can present and then come back with rebuttals and make sure you covered the specifics of what they responded to. Whereas if you're not setting up, like say an atheist is doing more of a like something like what Matt Dillahunty or someone might do, where they're more listening to what you're saying and then presenting what they see as problems with that than they are, although that's not really fair because Matt has brought divine hiddenness and problem of evil. But I think you see what I mean. Like one of the typical ways that atheists today will will function in a debate is just kind of listening to what you're saying and pointing out why that doesn't work, or they don't think it's good enough or whatever. And the Christian's got to build this formal structure. I think that's got something to do with it.
Yeah, I think that's so true, that if you have an open discussion, you have the potential for, you're trying to maybe make this broad case, like a cumulative case, kind of like a William Lane Craig 20-minute opener that he does in his debates with like the Kalam, teleological, moral, resurrection argument, and then the properly basic beliefs. Is if you start with a discussion, though, nobody's going to let you in an open dialogue talk for 20 minutes to set the whole thing up. You at best are maybe going to get through like the first or second premise of the Kalam. And then you're going to get into the weeds already, where the atheist might say, well, I disagree already, and let me explain why, which in a normal conversation makes sense, that you then go deeper into the weeds. But in that case, you never got to put out your whole cumulative case. You get kind of down in the weeds right away before giving this more robust and clear case for why these independent lines of converging evidence suggest Christianity. So I 100% think that's true. And by the way, Mike Jones, I always bring up because I think independent attestation is important. Mike Jones has seen this pattern as well, where he said, yeah, Christians tend to do better with more formal statements. And I think that's probably the biggest thing, is that you get stuck in the weeds before you can really lay out the whole case. Because I brought it up last time, the creation evolution argument, which is a different type of argument, but nonetheless, there's this similar principle, is similar to Christianity. So if, let's say, and this is why I would say hopefully atheists can emphasize with what I'm saying here, is that the Christian might say, well, here's my case, and they bring up, the first point, and the atheist says, oh, that's just such a terrible point, and they say, well, but give me a sec to like unpack all of it. It's not that there's this one juggernaut argument that just shows definitively that Christianity is true. It's these more subtle converging lines of evidence that by themselves are, I agree, not as strong. And same thing with, if, let's say, an evolution creationist argument was happening, is that sometimes creationists do this, like I've seen Kent Hovind do this in the past, where he'll say, what's your best, all right, everybody, what's your best line of evidence for evolution? And then they'll go, okay, well, here's my, best argument. And then Kent will oftentimes appropriately, because, by one single line of evidence by itself for evolution, you say, well, it's not very compelling if that's like your best. And so, in other words, I think that formal statements are the way to go.
I don't know if anybody hasn't seen this yet, but this is all I'm going to say about it. But I remember in, let's say, 2008 or something like that, maybe, no, before that, 2006 or 7, Kent Hovind went on the Ali G show with Sacha Baron Cohen. I don't know have you seen that, James?
I've seen that episode, yeah.
That's awesome. Something that people, just the train spotters, can go maybe hunt down after this for not that I endorse either, the Ali G show or the brand of apologetics that Kent Hovind suggests. But in any case, so that's one. What else you got, James?
Here's another one. I saw this recently. When it comes to for example, the argument for the resurrection, Christians oftentimes, I think so much of debate is using good self-control and self-regulation to not take the bait of what's being said. As an example, if a Christian says, here's my case for the resurrection, and let's say they give the minimal facts type argument, such as from William Lane Craig or Habermas Lacona, is that they'll give the argument, and then the atheist will go, well, but we don't have any contemporary sources. None of those sources that you mentioned, well, there are a couple. This is the first example. They'll say none of those sources that you mentioned are contemporary with Jesus. They weren't written while Jesus was alive. And the atheist, or the Christian, oftentimes, rather than challenging the credibility of the atheist on whether or not this is an appropriate criteria, rather than just some arbitrary criteria set up by, I'm not trying to sound mean, but relative to scholars, atheist bloggers, that I'm like, well, I'm going to go, if I have to choose between atheist bloggers' criteria for believing in this historical case for an argument versus, or I should say, for evaluating historical evidence versus scholars, obviously I'm going to go with the scholars. And so in other words, the Christian oftentimes will start saying, oh, well, let me think of some contemporary ones. They'll start trying to think of it. And it's like, no, like don't take that as some sort of actually necessary criteria, because historians would say, oh, we don't need contemporary sources. That's not necessary to have strong evidence for something. You can have it be after the lifetime of an individual. And it can still be compelling evidence, especially if you have, again, that independent converging testimony from
Mm-hmm.
different sources. So that's another one, is that Christians oftentimes will try to placate the atheist, where it's as if the atheist were a credible, uh, as if they were an authority, which is, it's just like, well, if they're naming these criteria that they themselves have just come up with, that they know
Yeah.
that the Bible doesn't have, and that scholars themselves wouldn't use, then I would point that out. I'd say, wait, why are you seem to diverge from actual academic criteria here, and you come up with your own arbitrary criteria, and really call them on it, really go hard and say, this is just arbitrary. Like, so
I
that's
think
the
that's a
big.
really interesting point because, you know, I'm thinking about Richard. You know, like we have a wealth of better ways to answer this. Like you were saying, if someone raised specifically that issue, well, where's the contemporaneous source during Jesus's life? And you're also right that my first thought was to go, well, you know, some people say that maybe the Q document or is the sayings material, and maybe that was collected by Matthew and all this sort of thing. But that's not where you go. That's not what you're right. What we can much more easily say is something like, well, look, Richard Bauckham has written an incredible work on issues related to this. And one thing that we can say is that these documents, some of these documents were written during the lives of the guarantors of the gospel message. Like when Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15 that you know, this is the gospel I preached when I was with you. But he also mentions in Galatians that you know, that he went and talked to the apostles and everything. But the point was, he's giving them the assurance that the people who actually handled all these things that you already know about, they're affirming of what's being said here. And I think it seems like that the Christian community at the time did look to, is what you're saying endorsed by living apostles? Why is that not as good as, or a good response to something like, well, it's not contemporaneous? Well, it's contemporaneous with the people that initially experienced these things, right?
That's a good point. So it is good to, you could say, kind of take a two-pronged approach of, one, saying, I don't accept this criteria as necessary, but even for the sake of argument, I do think we have good kind of contemporary
Close to
Jesus
contemporary. Yeah.
types of evidence. So that, I agree, that's a good way to go about it. And I would also add, in my first response, what I would have added in the first place is then citing, and this is something I'd have to go back and like check my notes. I haven't looked for it for a while, but citing historical scholars, of which they would say, like, if we do have two independent sources that are early, and by them they don't mean early as in contemporary with Jesus, they mean within, let's say, 50 years or 40 years, is that, for example, like Paul's epistles, is that you could say, hey, we do have scholars that would say that just two independent sources that are early, not contemporary, but early, that would say, like, that's actually, as to quote Craig, pay dirt. Like, that's actually like, wow, like, we're doing really well for that field, namely ancient Near Eastern history at that time. So that would be.
That's really good. But your principal point there, I guess, is don't let your opponent make up criteria. Don't let your
Exactly.
opponent treat their criteria as though they are the accepted criteria. Listen to what they're saying, and if what they're saying shouldn't affect your case, we'll point that out for those reasons that you give. And really, that could go both ways. I guess you could have a Christian say something that's not really good criteria for assessing a particular piece of evidence, and the atheist has to point that out. So, but that's interesting. I like that one. That's helpful.
And there's another one, just really quick before we go to the number three. But the other one would be, an example of this is when they have, let's say, an empiricist approach, and they say, well, I'm an empiricist, give me some empirical evidence for God. And you're like, I'm not an empiricist, I think it's silly, so I'm not going to meet your criteria. In fact, I think you're really, really pressing hard on that criteria. And as an example of that, you might use everybody, you must remember, you've seen this probably, the famous clip with William Lane Craig and Peter Atkins, where and this is like a really old school clip where Peter Atkins says, well, I think he, in some way, shape, or form, says, I have taken this empiricist approach for my epistemology, and Craig says, well, there are many reasons to reject that, and he rattles off the 5 right off the top of his head. But I'll give it to you so you can link it in the description, where it was just this. It's like this epic William Lane Craig clip where he gives 5 exceptions to empiricism, such as, for example, I think the first one he starts with is he says, well, mathematic or logical truths, like science presupposes math and logic, and so to use science to make the case for them would be arguing in a circle, given that science already presupposes them in order to work in the first place. And then he goes on and gives another 4 you could say, examples where no, empiricism doesn't seem to be a good epistemology. So, but that just really calling their standards out, because oftentimes their standards are unusually high. And by that I mean, well, let me be fair. Because I do want to, not all atheists do this, so I want to be so fair about that. Some atheists will use arbitrary standards that are arbitrarily high, I suspect because they have a bias against the supernatural. And again, that's only some atheists, so I don't want to indict all atheists. Yeah, and the third one I would bring up is that oftentimes, and this is just what it is to be human, so we'll talk about these inconsistent standards that atheists themselves, just like theists, to be fair, sometimes don't hold themselves to. They don't even recognizing they're violating the standard. And so, but before I talk about that, and remind me to talk about the problem of evil and how Christians are willing to engage with that argument. I just want to quick summarize just so people know where we are, because we talked about a top 5. So 1, as I had mentioned, Christians are better off in structured debates. Number 2 was that I had mentioned that Christians have to call out standards or criteria set up by skeptics that sometimes are just silly. And 3, in terms of, you could say, being consistent with yourself throughout the debate, here's an example. So if an atheist were to say, I want some empirical evidence here, and simultaneously at some point they give an argument against God's existence, let's say they use the problem of evil, there's an inconsistency there in terms of kind of like how they're operating in this debate. And what I mean by that is
they're using a philosophical argument.
Exactly. Is that they just said, like, I'm an empiricist, give me some empirical evidence for God. And then at some point, maybe 45 minutes later in the discussion, then you move on to different topics, and they bring up the problem of evil. And you should say, well, wait a minute, I thought you were an empiricist. Like, I'm willing to engage with you on the problem of evil, even though it's not an empiricist type argument. It's a philosophical type argument. This is common that I think people just don't realize that they're not actually in accord with their own standards. Here's another example I can think of. This is, if let's say you maybe started the conversation, it's probably good to just get this out of the way. You say, well, are you an evidentialist? By that I mean, would you say that beliefs should only depend on evidence? And that, for example, you would say, because people might say, of course, well, what else would there be? Well, like William James type arguments, you could say, or like Pascal's wager would be one in which you're saying, well, I'm not believing based on evidence. In the case of Pascal's wager, you might say, I'm believing because it's, this wager, like if I get it right, it's basically an argument rooted in decision theory. Oh yeah, well, what I'm referring to in terms of like William James, I was thinking of, he gave this, so he's a psychologist who was at Harvard in the 1800s and also kind of a philosopher, kind of like into spiritual stuff. And he had said, I think you should believe when it kind of like increases your probability of a good outcome in your life. So for example, like if you're in the forest, this is his example, and you have a broken leg or what might be a broken leg, and like, let's say it looks really bleak where you're thinking, I don't think I'm going to get home. I think I'm probably going to be left out here to die. You would be better off, even though you maybe think the evidence says otherwise, to tell yourself, like, I can make it and I am going to make it. You're better off to keep the hope, you could say, and tell yourself and try to believe by telling yourself.
Against evidence, actually.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
I think a great example, I bet you heard the same clip, James, because we look at the same sort of stuff. Do you remember Cosmic Skeptic saying something about this not too long ago with respect to the Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King? He was talking about a moment in the movie where there was every reason to believe that Frodo was dead, that they were not going to make it and destroy the ring, that it was all, there was no hope. Maybe at some point there was even clothes brought. Oh, look, they're dead, and against all the evidence is we should believe based on the evidence that Frodo and Sam are dead. But that actually wasn't the best thing to believe in the moment, because it turns out they weren't, first of all, but secondly, it motivated the continuing struggle, to succeed and overcome.
100%. You got it exactly. So in that case, you might say, oh, okay, then, I see a reason that maybe you'd believe in something, even though it's not based on evidence. It's more based on just trying to produce a better outcome for yourself. Like you're trying to motivate yourself to keep going and at least keep trying. And then Pascal's wager is not quite like that, but it would be, and I'm not advocating for these types. We'll go back to the main point, but Pascal's wager would be kind of like, well, you're just kind of like, you have to decide on something. And so, you decide on the one that you think will have the best outcome for you in the, kind of the eternal stretch. But going back to the, I'm not trying to argue for non-evidentialist positions. I'm just trying to explain what they are. The reason being, going back to that original point, namely, sometimes people will use standards that they don't hold themselves to. And so they might say at the beginning of the conversation, I'm an evidentialist. Like I would say those other reasons are not good, the ones we just covered. However, then they may invoke, Occam's razor, which is not an evidentialist, you could say, kind of epistemological tool. It's not. Like there's no empirical paper that has ever shown that simpler explanations are better in any field. Like that's not there. It just doesn't exist. This is an epistemologically non-evidentialist approach of preferring simpler things, basically just because of their aesthetic. They're just easier to like mentally grasp, or there's just a preference for simplicity that like I said, almost like an aesthetic, like it just looks nicer, seems nicer. Maybe it's just easier to use. That's in science that people might say, well, that's just easier to kind of remember and apply. But again, none of those are evidentialist criteria. And so if someone does use Occam's razor, that's a great opportunity to say, well, hold on, just to be sure, like you're not an evidentialist. So if you, let's say, wanted to make the case for Pascal's wager or Jamesian, William James type arguments, then that opens the door for you where you can say, okay, well, good, then I'm going to use these arguments since you wouldn't be close to them since you're not an evidentialist. But I'm just surprised. Occam's razor, I think, is a bit overrated because, one, most people who invoke it, I think, don't even realize it's not an evidentialist criteria.
So, but to summarize, or to get back to the main issue of this particular point you're making, is we would say just notice if they insist on only evidentialist type reasoning, and you notice that they're using non-evidentialist stuff to make their point, make their case, then point that out, and you're free to do the same if you're so inclined. Is that kind of what we're saying?
Yeah, 100%. And here's one last. This is the third example, because this is we have the top 5 for the whole video, and then we're on point number 3 of the top 5, which is that sometimes people use standards that are actually inconsistent throughout the discussion. And in particular, we the first example, sub-example, we'll say that we gave that, because I'm going to give 3. One is that they might be an empiricist and then later on invoke a philosophical argument like the problem of evil. Then right now, what we just finished talking about was, let's say they claim to be an evidentialist, but then they're using Occam's razor, which isn't an evidentialist. You could say an anti-evidentialist. It's different from it type of approach. And then the third one is, so let's say you're arguing about the resurrection. I've seen this before. At one point they may say, oh, I don't count the Gospels, or let's say the Acts. Let's say they say, I'll give you the Gospels, but I won't give you Acts. I think that's written too late. And I don't know, I just don't think it's as reliable. And then maybe later in the discussion, I saw this in a Mike Winger debate with Apologia, is that they'll say that, but then they'll try to explain away Paul's experience of Christ on the road to Damascus. They'll say, well, you remember his, because his symptoms or what he was experiencing looked a lot like having a seizure. So, for example, in Acts, when it says that he fell on the ground and that he was blinded temporarily, that looks like it kind of fits with a seizure. And I love that Mike Winger in this debate was so sharp, and he remembered that earlier in the debate, this atheist had said, well, I won't give you Acts. And Mike says, but isn't that from Acts? Like what you're talking about right now about Paul falling on the ground and being blinded temporarily. That's not in the Gospels and it's not in his epistles. Like you're getting that from Acts. And didn't you earlier in the debate tell me that you wouldn't count that as a credible source? So
Wow.
it was a great example of Mike catching that was really impressive because a lot of Christians, there's just so much information going back and forth in a debate that they're not being a lot of Christians that it takes a lot of discipline, a lot of self-restraint, a lot of self-control to remember like, hey, he counts this, he doesn't count this, and then later in the debate to be able to pull that back up. Because Paul was like, he just didn't have an answer. He was just like, oh, it was just a great response from Mike. So
I
that's the
think
third example.
if I was Paul in that situation, I might say, okay, you're right. I don't. And so if you brought something from Acts, it wouldn't convince me. But you do believe in Acts, and so I'm showing you what your book says. What would you
That's
say in a
true.
situation like that? Or would that be a good
Yeah,
comeback?
if it is, I think that if it was said, it would have been good. And what
Mm-hmm.
I would say is, I don't think it does fit the hallucination criteria based on Acts. So, long story short, this third point was just that not everybody's consistent throughout the debate, and I don't want to indict just atheists. I think it's often it's just accidental. People don't realize it, and so Christians do it too. I just want to be. I know
Sure.
that I sound like I'm ragging on atheists, but I want to be clear that there are plenty of sophisticated atheists and honest atheists, and many. In fact, I'd say that's so.
Well,
We can move on.
absolutely, and that's why with the first point, or the second point, I guess, I try to make the same point. That hey, look, this could go the other way. You could have an atheist frustrated that a Christian is being inconsistent or something or whatever the other point was. This is the channel that loves atheists, James. So we're good.
That's good.
All
We
right,
can move on.
you got a number 4.
Yeah, so so some of these are a little bit like disjointed. I'm trying to figure out like what would be how would I summarize this with a broader statement? This is more of like a singular point that's just interesting. I don't know. I would just say it's like a little thing that I notice is sometimes, and these are kind of low hanging fruit now. So these are less abstract. These are like more specific little empirical claims and things. So these are the ones that kind of drive me the most crazy because when I hear sometimes people say something and I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's just not like it's not
Okay, so
true.
future debaters on modern day debate, just know James is not going to stop you and make a point about this, but this is what's going through his head if you do whatever he's about to say.
100% is I let the other debater handle it. And an example would be like sometimes there are just, you could say, misleading claims, probably misunderstood by atheists themselves. But let's say they say that, well, atheism is growing globally. Like, we're finally seeing the internet and the spread of information. That's like back 10 years ago, that used to be a more common claim. Although it's ironic because like flat Earth has become way bigger since then. So I don't know if the internet really has helped. But
Yeah.
I would say that sometimes atheists will say, like atheism is growing and, there are more people that are becoming atheists every day, as if atheists, as if like religion was shrinking, and that's not the case. Because you might think, well, if atheism is growing, it has to be the case that it's kind of taking over religious territory or ground, but it's not. And here's the way in which it's true and the way in which it's false. In whole numbers, it's growing because the population is growing, but it's actually as a proportion of the globe shrinking. In other words, it's growing, but not as fast as Christianity and Islam, for example. So that actually, as a proportion, it's shrinking. It's just that in terms of whole numbers, like actual numbers, like let's say the number of atheists, I don't know, I'm just using easy number, 100,000 on the planet. That's way more than that. But let's say it's like, yeah, each day, let's say there are 10 people added onto that 100,000, but with Christianity and Islam, which have each maybe like 2 billion or so, there's like, instead of 10 being added, like 50 being added. So that's one thing is I've noticed that being said, and I just think it's worth pointing out that if atheists think like, oh yeah, the internet and our arguments and us being out there making the case is changing things, it doesn't look like it. Maybe it's even doing worse for atheism. That's one of the smug things I see in the comments all the time. Is,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah,
Christians,
that's
go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, you would be the person to know about this. I remember, I don't know, a year ago or a couple of years ago, I said the same thing. I said something like, "Okay, if you think that because of the internet, everybody's got all this access to information, and so the old myths and things are dying out, and that's what we're seeing, then how do you explain the rise in flat Earth belief?" And a lot of the responses were, well, you're just uneducated because flat earth belief is actually on the decline. And maybe that's true, I don't know, but if it is true, it rose. I mean, I would think so. Do you actually know whether it's on the decline in general, flat earth belief?
Flat Earth, I don't know. I would I don't know if there's a study that's been done. I purely off of anecdotal observation of these communities online, I would suspect it's growing, but I could be wrong about that. But it's
Well, I mean,
nonetheless.
it maybe, but maybe it's not growing. Maybe it's in decline, but that doesn't mean it always was. And I have to believe when I'm looking at YouTube channels with hundreds of thousands of subscribers and armies of flat earthers, making points, I have to believe that a few people got flat earth evangelized because of the internet, right?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's why I would suspect that it's actually grown, is that the internet has allowed people with weird beliefs to find each other and,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, indirectly encourage each other, or even directly encourage each other with these, Facebook groups or whatever. But I would say if it is shrinking, well, that's good. It's just like atheism, and both of them deserve to shrink as a proportion. So I think that's fair. But I would say my source for the atheism shrinking is the peer review, or the Pew, which is a peer reviewed level type of research. So like the
Mm-hmm.
Pew is like a very respected source that has actually found this, and it's yeah. So that's
Do you
something I
think
just
people
wanted to
get a
put
little
out.
bit do you think people get a little bit provincial about this? So like, hey, I'm in the Western world, so I'm only looking at the Western world, and in the Western world, atheism seems to be growing. Yeah, okay, maybe in third world countries or something, or China, maybe it's growing, but where I'm at, we're winning. It's getting more secular all the time. Do you think that's how people think about this?
I'm sure it is. I think that, well, my only thought is if you really want to needle them, you might press them in being maybe a little bit ethnocentric in terms of only focusing on their own, our Western culture,
Mm-hmm.
and say, well, globally, like it seems like Eastern people is just important, just as important what they believe too, right? But I do think that, yeah, they probably would say that it's westernized, that in the West at least, atheism is growing, which is, although again, I feel like it's a little bit convenient that, like, rather than using the globe, like as if Western or Eastern people are like, why should their vote or beliefs be less important? It's strange to focus on one sub pocket, because I'm sure you can find some pockets throughout the world where atheism is growing, but nonetheless, globally, it's shrinking in
We can
terms of
probably
numbers.
find some pockets in the U.S. where it's growing. I don't know how far do you want to limit this neighborhood, this county? I mean, you can,
Right.
if you're going to
Yeah.
limit it. Yeah.
If you zone in on the right spot, you can find something that corroborates your view. No
Right.
matter how weird your view is.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, what do you have next?
How do I summarize that? That would just maybe be. I want to give one other example. I just think that there is kind of an Achilles heel sometimes. Maybe I want to be fair. Not all atheists, but some atheists will make empirical claims like that are just false. Another
Mm-hmm.
one is that, like, you very clearly see in these debates with like Mike Jones and Matt Dillahunty. This is an old one. It happened on the Non Sequitur show a long time ago. It was a different YouTube channel, kind of like Modern Day Debate. And then there was also the debate with Mike Jones and Aaron Raw on the same topic, whether or not Christianity or religion is harmful. And the empirical evidence is so clear. So I think it's 2016, Azim Sharif and other authors. This is their peer-reviewed meta-analysis, if I remember the publication date right. But I know it's for sure Sharif, Shariff, 2016, where they did this meta-analysis of religious priming. So in other words, you give subtle primes, like subtle symbols that people would see of, like, let's say religious symbols, and that they tended to be more pro-social after that. Even atheist groups in some cases would be more pro-social after seeing this, you could say, I wouldn't say subliminal, but subtle religious symbol that people don't really realize that they saw it. So sometimes like, here's an example of how you can do this. You can give them a crossword puzzle, and it's suffused with am I not a crossword puzzle? What's one of those, where it's got like a big square and it's just filled with letters? It's like a word find where you have
Oh,
to
yeah.
see, like,
Find the word scramble.
yeah, yeah, exact word scramble. That's it.
Yeah.
Is if you give participants a word scramble, you can suffuse it with religious terms like faith or God or church, and then you can ask them afterwards, like, did you notice anything weird about this? Like, did you notice any theme behind this puzzle? And they'll say, oh, no, I didn't. So, like, they're seeing these, and because you'll circle, they'll find some of those words like church or whatever, and they'll circle them so that they were seeing them, versus a word scramble that has no religious words in it, just more neutral words like chair, things that really you wouldn't have reason to believe would make them more pro-social or less pro-social. Anyway, when they do see these religious words without even really realizing that they're kind of being primed toward religion or thinking about religion, they tend to be more pro-social in terms of their behavior. In other words, like giving behaviors, giving to others. And that's something that you've seen. I'm just going to say, if you want to watch Mike Jones's debates, he's done very well, especially because it's so annoying too. That here's another thing that sometimes I see in debates is people will go, well, I have studies too, and so I have a couple of studies here that say that religion in some way caused more negative behavior. And I think Tom Jump, to be fair, in his most recent debate with Aaron and Ra on this topic of whether or not religion is harmful, and Mike Jones have done a good job of saying, you have one or two studies. I have a meta-analysis, which is basically a weighted average of many studies. Oftentimes 30 is kind of like, you need at least 30 studies in it, but sometimes they can have like 70 or 100 or hundreds. And so I want to give kudos to Tom Jump and Mike Jones, because Tom Jump actually argued in favor of religion, namely saying, like, no, it doesn't do more harm than good. It actually is pretty good for society. And so I want to give kudos to those guys for kind of staying on the ball and saying, okay, good, you've got these. My meta-analysis is summarizing 102 studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course the distinction between that I remember coming up in a lot of those debates is the extrinsic versus intrinsic religious person. So there's a difference between a nominal Christian who goes to church twice a year or occasionally and might say they're a Christian and they believe these things, or might say they're a Muslim and they believe these things, but functionally it doesn't really seem like they do. And if you pin them down, they might not, something like that, versus someone like me or you who, whether we're a good person or not, we're at least saying, no, like, we think that personal conversion is very important. We think that we attend church, I think they say on average 3 times a month. And when you look at those two, because a lot of times when people say, well, I know that about these horrible things Christians have done. Well, yeah, and it may sound like the No True Scotsman or something, but there really is like a distinction in the literature about someone who is, nominally a religious person or not. And I think that that's important. I took that away from those debates, and those are really enjoyable debates.
That's a great point. I want to add that too, in terms of like these empirical claims where sometimes, I hate to say this is not all atheists, but some atheist circles online, they're just living in their own world. Like, I'm not exaggerating. Some, not all, but some, they just seem to have their own reality. And so another example is, I see like in the comments sometimes, if a Christian is moody during the debate, they go, oh man, why are Christians always so unhappy? And this came up in Mike Jones's debate on which group is more happy, religious or non-religious. If a person is intrinsically religious, namely that they're actually living, they're saying, hey, I'm religious and I'm living for God. Like, I want God to be my main purpose in life. Versus extrinsically religious, they're maybe like, well, I go to church because it helps me have a strong community network. It's like, you could do that at a book club too. It's not very religious per se. Is that those who are intrinsically religious are definitely happier. it's like the data is absolutely clear, and that's which you could say it seems to be like the truer form of religion, like I said, because you're saying I've lived for God rather than building a community network that you could do in non-religious circles too. And so you could say like the truer form of religion, the empirical data there too, the meta-analyses have been done. Religious people are happier. Like the evidence is so clear, and I see comments all the time from, like I said, there are some atheists that I think live in their own reality. Like genuinely, they're so maybe purposely, maybe on accident, they're so deceived that they're like, oh man, these religious people are miserable. And by the way, there's also not only that in terms of life satisfaction measures for religious people. They also tend to have, and I wouldn't say that you're like not religious if you ever experience depression or anxiety or whatever, but nonetheless, you put it this way. Let's say a religious person has depression and anxiety, which it happens, obviously.
Sure.
And so someone says, well, are you not religious? And you'd say, well, like I am religious. But according to the research, if I was not religious, I'd be even more depressed. Like that's what the research shows. In other words, people who are intrinsically religious, especially, the more religious they are, the less depression they have, the less anxiety they have. Virtually every So let me go back really quick too. If you look at the big five traits, which is kind of like the conventional, I had mentioned conventional model of personality among psychologists, like Jordan Peterson's talked about this a lot, is neuroticism, which is it's not actually a mental health disorder or anything. It's just a trait of having more negative emotion, is also lower among those who are high in religiosity. There's a correlation, in other words, an indirect one or an inverse one, where the more religious you are, the less neurotic you are. And like I said, neurotic is just not depression, not anxiety. It's just proneness to fear, anger, sadness. And so there are some things that I see in the comments and I'm like, these people just seem to be in their own world. It's bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah. It is really interesting. You have to, we have to, and I'm not saying this about any particular person, but husbands, wives, kids, students, employees, people in various positions like atheist, Christian, Muslim, whatever, we have to build a way of thinking about our position in the world, and we have to think about, well, why are they this way? Why am I this way? Why are all these things? And we have to build a just so story, I think, and sometimes those just so stories can be false. I know a bunch of mean Christians who are hateful toward gay people and hateful toward, whatever, and we have in our picture in our mind of the old angry white man at a Baptist church somewhere, and of course that's true sometimes. And so as a result, we build this just so story in our mind about the way somebody is, and they're not happy. They're mad all the time. These Christians are always against everything. And I think it can happen to me too, that sometimes what we build into our just so story, it doesn't reflect reality, even if it may seem to help us feel better about our situation. I don't know.
100%. Yeah. So that was the fourth point, which you might say like some circles, and like I said, very, very much just some, because I'm going for low hanging fruit here.
Yeah.
Are empirical, like you could say their own empirical claims are just false. And the last one might be, this is again, I'm trying to think of what a broad one be. So let me just review, just because I always like it to have it be nice and tidy. Of like the first point was, and you might need to help me with this because my in terms of my working memory, trying to remember all this. The first one,
if we come up with good ways to say it, I'll put them on the screen so people listening already know whether I thought it was clear or not.
The first one was, if I remember right, oh man,
formal versus informal debates.
Oh yes, you're right. Structured debates are better for theists generally. I'm not saying it has to be that way. Then number two, if I remember right, was these arbitrary standards sometimes used by atheists, where, for example, they'll say, well, we don't have any contemporary sources about Jesus, in which case you can cite, one I was going to cite earlier was John Dominic Crossan. I think he's passed away, but was a scholar, an atheist scholar even, that said two independent sources is quite strong, even if they're early but not contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
And number three, if I remember right, that was, so we talked about, I think that was, Oh yeah, so we talked. Number two was arbitrary standards, kind of acting as an authority and creating these standards that are not
Inconsistency is the next
inconsistency
one.
in terms of, for example, at one point saying one's an evidentialist and invoking Occam's razor later, or saying you're an empiricist but using the problem of evil later. And then the last one that we just covered, number four, was the empirical claims are sometimes just flat out false. Where for me, working on my doctorate in psychology, sometimes I hear these and I know like how the examples we covered, like the social sciences, I know the kind of errors that are being made there, and I'm like, okay, this is bad. And then number five, this is one that's hard. It's just like I would maybe just say in some, if you push back on some of these like low hanging fruit arguments, they're so bad. And Christians do it too. So I'm not trying to stereotype when I say that atheists use these some arguments that are so bad. So hopefully there are atheists out there who realize like I'm not trying to paint with broad brushstrokes across the atheist community. I'm just trying to pick on like some of the stuff that has to go. It's just so bad. And hopefully they agree with me and they say, James, I am an atheist that doesn't use those arguments you've mentioned, but and so this doesn't bother me that you point these things out, and I agree with you that they have to go. And just the same way I would concede some Christians use bad arguments. Last one, as an example of how bad some of these are. If someone says, well, these Christians like, oh, they think that their religion is the true one. How convenient. Like, oh, but all the other ones happen to be wrong. It's just their special one. Is that, in other words, like picking on Christianity's exclusivity and saying like, oh, you think only your view is right. Okay. But as Craig has pointed this out, great. He's done a great job of pointing out, the atheist is no more, or I should say, no less exclusive than the Christian. In other words, if you think about it, atheists also say everybody except those who hold their position of, namely the idea that there is no God, is wrong. So they also say that the Muslim is wrong. They also say that the Jewish, you say classical, or what's the word? Not
Orthodox.
Reformed. Orthodox Jewish, they would say the Orthodox Jewish people are wrong, and the Muslims are wrong, and the Hindus are wrong. Is that not only would we say, well, wait a minute, like atheists also say that they're the only correct position, but not only that, in pure numbers, it's actually atheists that are even more exclusive. And let me explain, is that Christians have about two, like, and this is like whether or not there's genuine belief in these Christians is a different issue. But in terms of like intellectual assent, you could say, like where they say, yeah, I agree that, God exists and Jesus is the Son, like, is that there are about almost 2 billion, if I remember right, people on the planet that would say, yes, like I agree with that. So Christians would be saying, admittedly, like a lot of people are wrong, namely, like, what are we at, 7 or 8 billion? Let's just use 7 for, is, they'd be saying like 5 billion are wrong because they're not Christians. But if you look at it in terms of numbers, well, atheists are way less than 2 billion. I mean, maybe, like I said, like, let's be super generous and say that they make up 1 billion. Well, then compared to the Christian who says that 5 billion are wrong, the atheist says that 6 billion are wrong. So in other words, like, it's absolutely the case that the atheist is actually more exclusive than the Christian, and nonetheless hypocritically kind of pointing fingers like this. Yeah. And then, again, this is like low-hanging fruit stuff, so I don't want to.
Right. But yeah,
that's it in a nutshell.
That's pretty interesting, because really what it all boils down to, James, is that when you say, oh, how convenient, or you're so special that your religion happens to be the right one of all the religions. Hold on. All you're saying there is, oh, you think you're right. Yes. And you think you're right, right? And and you're saying a lot more people are wrong than I'm saying are wrong, is your point, right?
Oh yeah, exactly. Is that the atheist, like, assuming that there are classical atheists that would say, God does not exist, then like they're actually saying way more people are wrong in terms of pure numbers, like persons out there, than I am. And it's just, so in that case, it's hypocritical that they'd be trying to indict me for it, when actually classical atheism is even more exclusive.
Yeah, man, that's a good list. I like that. I think this will be helpful. And maybe when you notice new ones, we'll have you back on and talk about new insights that you have. We could do one. I mean, I noticed that, we made appropriate connections that most of this could be done by a Christian, not just an atheist. But I'd be happy for you to come on and specifically talk about here's what I think Christians do wrong, or I don't understand why they do it, or whatever. Just like that. That'd be perfectly fine as well. So, well, I'll tell you, James, I'm glad that we've kind of started chatting and talking about some of this stuff. This is really great. Last night you had a debate, or yesterday, maybe?
I think it was Tuesday. We're on Thursday now,
Bosch?
so 2 days ago. Oh, that was like Saturday, maybe.
Oh,
Bosch
okay.
versus Sanvi. Yeah, that was a great debate. That one, people love that.
I need to go back and finish that. When I started, it got about halfway through, but thanks for everything you're doing, man. Is there anything you want to say about all of this while you're here?
Oh yeah. Well, we'd love to have you at Modern Day Debate, folks. If you enjoy debates, in fact, that's the thing too is we want strong Christian debaters, and I sometimes worry that sometimes people see because it's true. Like sometimes the same way that I kind of picked on atheists today. There are sometimes not so strong atheist type arguments or not so experienced atheist debaters. Likewise, there are some less experienced Christian debaters, and we want strong Christian debaters. So I hope you feel I'm at moderndaydebate@gmail.com. And so there are many Christians that I have to reach out to and say, hey, we'd love to have you on. But I would like to have people reach out to me to feel comfortable to say, like, hey, like I'd be willing to. And we really do want to give everybody a fair shot. Christian, atheist, you name it. We do want to be as fair as possible. We hope people feel welcome. I know that our audience in the comment section would make you think we're an atheist channel because it's just dominated by atheists running campaigns for their side saying that they won. But we're actually a neutral channel. And so, we let people say what they want, if they want to claim
Yeah.
atheism is true or whatever. But we
It
do
might tell
want
you
Christian
something if you have
so
to run around telling everyone how they should think about the debate that just happened right in front of them.
Exactly. That's what I like. I'm amazed that some of these comments are just so simple as like, oh man, so and so dominated. And
Yeah.
I'm just like, if it's so obvious that, atheism won, atheism destroyed religion again. Like, if it's so obvious, why are like people taking their precious time to like sit and like write this into the comment section? But we would love to have new people at Modern Day Debate, and I'm at
Yeah.
moderndaydebate@gmail.com.
Well, one thing
So
I've noticed in this, James, in last week's discussion with you and this week is you are much more knowledgeable about, philosophy of religion, apologetics, broadly speaking, than I thought you were. I thought you were knowledgeable. I thought you were above average, but you are speaking with clarity and specificity about a number of things. And of course, you know that about yourself. I didn't realize the degree to which you are, and in talking with you, that you are a good apologist in your own right. I remember some years ago, maybe 2 years ago or something, someone didn't show up for a debate, and you ended up debating Pascal's wager, which you don't even defend based on today's discussion, and against T-Jump. And so for you to have to fill in for somebody against T-Jump, that's a weird person to debate for your first time debating on Modern Day Debate. Was that the first time on Modern Day Debate you debated somebody?
it might have been. That was like in our first year. So that was like
Oh yeah.
4 or more years ago when, yeah, the network wasn't as big. And so sometimes if, and in that case, if an atheist or if a Christian didn't show up, I was like, all
Mm-hmm.
right, well, it's like I'm going to jump in and just wing it. So, but yeah, I
Wow.
definitely enjoy these topics. So it's a
Yeah.
lot of fun. Thank
Well, I'm
you.
glad, and your background in psychology is, I'm sure, incredibly helpful, and in the future will be helpful as you function in this realm and perhaps minister in this realm. Even though, to remind everyone, it is a neutral debate platform. Even though James is he's a Christian, though you can't have him back. He's one of us, but. Brotherhood of Man, it's a great channel that we have on Modern Day Debate. Everybody there is treated very well. Yeah, of course, there's people in the comments that might act up a little bit, but I really think that even among some theists and atheists, there's a little bit of a community around it, and so that's good too.
100%. That we do hope for that. My hope is and that's why I want to give credit. Like I said, there are atheists who don't use the arguments I've used today, and they make the mistakes I've used today, who are pleasant and intellectually honest. And in fact, I'd say that's the majority of atheists that are out there. It's just that some, like where sometimes I'm a little bit like, okay. But
Real quick, I keep thinking of a couple of things I want to ask you. William Lane Craig, You've never had him on to debate, right?
We haven't, no.
Is that like the cup of Christ, is to get him to debate? That's your MacGuffin?
That's the holy grail. It would be epic to have William Lane Craig. We've reached out to him before, and he's such a busy guy. And so they were very polite and said, "Hey, we're sorry we could, but right now he's working on this new book or whatever." And so, he's my favorite apologist. I've met him once in person. This is like 8 or 9 years ago, maybe 10, and it was just a fantastic guy. In addition to the fact that he's, I think, the best defender there is alive today.
Yeah. Well, maybe one day you'll get him on there. Listen, man, it's been a blast having you, and to everyone else, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.